echoes of the other, the illusion that knows itself. Rumination 1. The dream and the initial cracks in reality. I remember the dream as if it were woven into my waking life. At first, it was only an elusive flicker in my consciousness, a sense of floating, or perhaps being suspended in some milky fluid. Slowly, details sharpened. I saw the form of my father standing in the backyard of my childhood home. He looked resolute, a figure from memory or myth. I was startled to find that, in this dream, I could not speak. No words. I was voiceless, and yet I felt an inexpressible presence swelling in my chest. My father said nothing. He only stared at me, as if challenging me to break the silence. But I couldn't. So I woke up, sheets drenched in sweat and my heart pounding. I had no idea then how this dream would become my perpetual nighttime companion. It was long, fractal, and recursive, returning each night with expansions, new contexts, and new scenes, continuing where it left off. As I slept, it enveloped me like an alternate life, a life in which I was permanently trapped in silent mode, forced to watch events unfolding around me while never speaking a single word. Night after night, for what felt like a small eternity, the dream repeated and advanced, always culminating in that gaze from my father. I started to wonder if I was living two existences, one in the mundane world of labs and lecture halls at the University of Texas at Austin, and another in the silent dimension of that dream. I am a neuroscientist by training. My name is Dr. Malcolm Winslow, and I've always held a steadfast belief that consciousness can be explained in purely naturalistic terms. I once took pride in scoffing at the phrase hard problem of consciousness, championed by philosophers like David Chalmers, finding it not quite as hard as they made it out to be. After all, I was working in a top-tier lab and had seen the dramatic leaps in our understanding of neural correlates, the complexities of cortical columns, the role of the claustrum, the functional significance of mirror neurons. Each new discovery seemed to bring us closer to bridging that explanatory gap from the neurobiological to the phenomenological. Yet this dream, this unbelievably long, haunting narrative that I lived in every night, shattered my complacency. In that silent domain, I began to develop an entirely different perspective on what it means to be a self. After all, my father in the dream was an other, an object of observation. But I, too, had become an object of observation, even to myself, because I was effectively mute and powerless in that dream world. If consciousness is so straightforwardly a product of neural activity, then why did this silent interior experience feel so rich, so fundamentally irreducible? Why was there a distinct what it is like that no one else could tap into? I made it my mission to unravel this. During the day, I would go to my lab and record data, run experiments, examine PET scans, EEG readings, or microelectrode recordings in non-human subjects. My nights became an involuntary expedition through that surreal, father-haunted world. Before I could even attempt to banish or interpret it away, I found myself intrigued by it. Something in that long dream seemed to whisper a secret about the nature of mind. I could feel the question forming, but never quite revealing itself in daylight. Soon it emerged. Impression is subjectivity. Expression is objectivity. In the dream, I had so much subjective content, an overwhelming impression of father, of yard, of silence, yet nothing was expressed. All that within existed, but was sealed off from any outward channel. To an outsider, I would be indistinguishable from a statue or a silent ghost. And in that realization, split between dream and waking life, a conceptual clarity settled in, as though a problem that had been in the background of my mind for years finally stepped into the spotlight. A growing obsession. At first, I scribbled random notes about the dream into my research journal, right between entries about cortical excitability and visual illusions. Subjectivity is quarantined unless expressed. We are trapped in our own heads. There is no direct route to other minds. And eventually, the line that appeared, day after day, in bold letters in my notebook. We never truly know the mind of another because we only see what is expressed. Yet I could not stop there. That initial statement was almost cliché among philosophers. After all, the idea that we have only indirect access to other minds is well-worn territory. But something in my dream experiences imparted new urgency. I wanted to argue that the impression, the subjective aspect, is the final frontier, locked away from the rest of the world. Expression, whether through language, gesture, or any outward sign, necessarily becomes an objective data point, something that can be studied and analyzed by others. In other words, expression is the objective representation of an inherently subjective core. It was so obvious, yet so transformative, because I saw it in a new light, that we only ever see the expression of others. We never see their impression. The raw feel, the qualia, is always absent from that outward vantage point. Each time I stepped into my lab, I carried this lens with me. My colleagues teased me about my increasingly philosophical remarks, but I found myself deeply immersed in this question. If impression is the private, subjective side of experience, and expression is the side that others can gauge, then how do we ever bridge that chasm? How do we talk about color, taste, or love when these experiences can never be shared directly? One evening, after an especially long day calibrating microelectrode arrays, I sat in my office staring at a blank page of notes meant for a conference paper. Instead, I jotted down two headings: impression and expression. I drew a line separating them. Impression, subjectivity; private, internal content; qualitative states, what it is like, felt only by the individual; expression, objectivity, public, observable output; communicated states, language, gesture, or other measurable signals, accessible to others' observation, but never wholly capturing the subjective. In my dream, these headings perfectly captured my predicament. I had a vast world of impression with no corresponding expression. Over the next few days, I found myself repeating the phrase in my mind whenever I was lecturing undergrads or conferencing with graduate students. All we see of one another is the expression. The impression remains hidden. Slipping into the twilight of dream. Eventually, the dream took hold of me more forcefully. The father figure in that dream would sometimes beckon me to follow him. We'd walk through the yard, then cross into a strange hallway reminiscent of an old medical building. Corridors turned labyrinthine. Each door led to a memory or a hypothetical conversation with someone I once knew. But I never spoke. I was a silent observer, a pure vantage point. Even more bizarrely, some nights I would see reflections of myself in reflective surfaces, mirrors, windows, puddles, and that reflection never moved in sync with me. It was as if my vantage point and my perceived body were disconnected in this dream reality. I could wave my hand in front of my face, but the reflection in the window would remain motionless, gazing at me instead of mirroring me. Out of that nocturnal labyrinth, a nagging question would greet me each morning. If I can't express anything, then to my father in that dream, do I even have a mind? Does he see me as conscious or as a soulless form? It was that question that began to unravel the theory of other minds in my own research, because in real life, we do the same thing, albeit in reverse. We look at others' expressions, facial expressions, voices, bodily gestures, to infer their internal states. We watch them laugh and figure they must be happy. We see them cry and assume they must be sad. But how do we truly know? Of course, we rely on our own introspection, imagining that we too would laugh if we felt joy. Thus, we project inward states onto others. But is that bridging the gap, or merely painting it over with illusions? Suddenly, I felt as though I stood on the precipice of some revelation. My father's silent gaze, night after night, was asking me, "How do you know that I have a mind, that I have a subjective realm? How do I know that you do?" Dr. Chen's confession. One of my colleagues, Dr. Stephanie Chen, a cognitive psychologist down the hall, noticed my new preoccupation. She was known among her students for her fierce intellect, matched only by her empathy. In a hushed conversation over coffee, after I'd confided the repeated dream to her, she nodded slowly. "You're fixating on the problem of other minds, Malcolm," she said, leaning against the battered lab countertop. "And that's classic. Everyone who wades into that territory eventually confronts how private consciousness is. But the real question is whether subjectivity is truly out of reach or simply incommunicable in certain respects." She had studied mirror neurons extensively, focusing on how these specialized cells in the premotor cortex respond both when a subject performs an action and when it observes the same action performed by another. These mirror neurons have often been invoked as a potential neural basis for empathy, an inroad to bridging subjective minds. "I wonder," Dr. Chen continued, "if you might glean something from mirror neuron research. The activation patterns in these neurons suggest we can model what others are doing or even feeling through neural resonance. It's like we simulate them internally." I was intrigued. "Simulation," I repeated softly, thinking of how, in my dream, I saw my father's face and tried to guess his thoughts, but I could never confirm them. "Does that simulation get us closer to their subjective world, or is it just a sophisticated guess?" Stephanie shrugged. "A guess is all we have, but it's surprisingly accurate, evolutionarily speaking. If it weren't, we wouldn't function so well as social animals." The doorway to evolution. That conversation with Dr. Chen kindled a new angle in my research. Maybe consciousness itself is tied to how we model others. If part of what makes us conscious is an ability to run offline simulations of other people's behaviors, anticipating their actions and mental states, then perhaps the subjective dimension we champion as the be-all and end-all is actually an emergent property of that modeling system. In other words, maybe the impetus for consciousness came from outward necessity, not an inward spark. I didn't want to jump to conclusions, but as I fell asleep that night, I mentally repeated Dr. Chen's suggestion. Consciousness might be a byproduct of our need to simulate others. In my dream, Father and I reached a new room. The corridor ended. We stepped inside, and it was some approximation of my present-day lab. Strange pieces of neural imaging equipment were pressed against the walls. My father quietly walked over to a blackboard, yes, a blackboard, old-school style, and wrote a single phrase with chalk, each letter drawn slowly. "Who is the subject?" He turned to me, as if waiting for an answer. I, still mute, stood paralyzed, wanting to speak but failing. It struck me then how in that dream scenario the question was directed to me, and yet it was as if my father expected me to realize I wasn't the subject at all. I was, in some sense, the object. Or if I were the subject, then ironically, I had no way to express that subjectivity. That tension knotted my stomach. Then I woke up. Seeds of a theory. That morning, I stumbled out of bed, grabbed my phone, and dictated a barrage of notes to myself. Consciousness might have evolved as a specialized function for modeling the behavior of others. We needed to guess how others felt to predict their actions. The best way to do that is to simulate from the inside out, effectively giving rise to an internal vantage point that ironically becomes a hallmark of subjectivity. Thus, consciousness arises from an externally oriented need, an evolutionary advantage, rather than some fundamental interior essence. I found the notion both electrifying and unsettling. Throughout my career, I had often encountered the idea that consciousness was an emergent property of complex neural processes, some even claiming it to be an illusion or at best a side effect. But never had I encountered the argument so specifically tied to the impetus of modeling other minds. It was akin to Copernicus telling us the Earth isn't the center of the cosmos, or Darwin unveiling that we are not divinely separate from the animal kingdom. Now, perhaps we are not the fountainhead of consciousness we imagine ourselves to be. Instead, our consciousness might be a reactive system, constructed out of necessity to model what is outside. I started to see illusions everywhere. In the lab, I'd watch the rhesus monkeys we used for some of our experiments. They had subtle forms of social intelligence, too. Could it be that the seeds of consciousness were sprouting in them, in the sense that they had to form mental maps of each other's behavior? And in humans, that system of modeling got ramped up over countless generations until it was no longer just about modeling others, but also modeling one's own processes, culminating in self-awareness. I shared some of these speculations with Dr. Chen, who was cautious but intrigued. You're basically claiming a radical inversion of the usual story. Most of us think, first, there's a self that perceives the world, and then we extend that viewpoint to guess that others have minds. You're suggesting it's the other way around, that to deal with other minds, we developed an internal self-model. Yes, I said, feeling that old excitement in my chest, like it's an artifact of evolution. We had to, in effect, imagine ourselves as an other in order to empathize or predict, and that imagination slowly turned into what we experience as self-awareness. Consciousness is the echo of that simulation, turned inward. She whistled softly. It's quite a leap, but if it were true, it would indeed shift the locus of consciousness from an intrinsic property of being human to a sophisticated hack, like the thumbs we use to manipulate objects. The sense of self becomes an emergent feature, not the prime cause. Doubt and intrigue. Not everyone embraced my emerging viewpoint. Some of my colleagues in the philosophy department found it interesting but incomplete. You can't simply ignore the raw, subjective feeling, one of them told me. You're describing the functionality of consciousness, but not how it feels from the inside. How does the modeling produce qualia? I recognized the classic question. At the time, I told him that was precisely the point. The reason it feels like something to be us is a byproduct of the system's attempt to simulate what it is like to be another. When we recursively reflect, we produce a sense of what it is like in ourselves. It's a side effect of running a constant internal simulation. He paused, eyebrows raised. So you believe the hard problem of consciousness could be reduced to an evolutionary storytelling about modeling others? I shrugged. Perhaps not reduced, but reframed. And maybe that's the conceptual leap we've been missing. If we started from the vantage point that consciousness is an internalization of outward modeling, that might reorient the puzzle significantly. But that was the rational line of argument. At night, in the dream, my father's silent gaze continued to dismantle my sense of place in the cosmos. I felt more like an observer there, or a camera lens with no operator. Where was I, truly, if I never spoke and never interacted? Perhaps I was gleaning in that dream environment the stark difference between impression and expression. I had an ocean of impressions, but zero expression. So from an external vantage point, I was no one. But from my vantage point, I was brimming with experience. In the waking world, it was becoming a mania. I was preparing a research talk for a small symposium in Dallas, ironically titled Mirror Neurons and the Evolution of Subjective Consciousness. But half the time, I was lost in reverie about how to incorporate my nighttime experiences. Sleep and wakefulness had started to blend in a most uncanny fashion. And so the seeds of this theory, impression, expression, a self as emergent from modeling others, began to flourish in my mind. I was no longer sure if it was brilliant or if I was losing my grip. But everything I had read in neuroscience, from the discovery of mirror neurons to the plasticity of the brain in social contexts, suggested that the mind is shaped profoundly by outward interactions. Our survival depends on reading others. Our ancestors needed to do so to band together, hunt, or avoid predators. That capacity for mental simulation became more and more sophisticated, eventually turning inward upon itself. And that, I hypothesized, was the birth of what we call consciousness. I wrote in my journal, in bold letters, consciousness is not the primary mover. It is a late arrival in evolution's toolbox, a reflection turned inward, originally shaped by the need to understand other minds. We have simply forgotten its true evolutionary origin. When I read those words back to myself, I felt a tremor of possibility and fear. No wonder the dream kept telling me I couldn't speak. In the real world, I was finally trying to speak something that had, perhaps, no easy articulation. Rumination 2. A deep dive into the theory of other minds. I have found that academic life is shaped by seasons. There is the semester rush, the summer lull, conference time, grant writing time, publication deadlines, and the small pockets of personal revelation that can occur at any moment in between. In the wake of my dream obsession, I entered a season of intense intellectual exploration, pulling every resource I could from our institution's library, cornering colleagues in the hallway, and scrutinizing the data from my lab with fresh eyes. The arrival of a stranger. During this time, I received an unexpected email from a doctor, Abraham van der Linde, a visiting philosopher from the Netherlands. He had read one of my earlier papers on the neural correlates of empathy and wanted to meet, intrigued by the rumors of my new line of thought. We arranged to chat in my office on a drizzly autumn afternoon. When he arrived, I was immediately struck by his penetrating gaze and the faint smell of pipe tobacco emanating from his coat. He took a seat, crossing one leg over the other, and calmly said, "Dr. Winslow, I hear you've been entertaining a notion that consciousness arises from the need to model other minds. That's quite an inversion of the usual stance. May I ask for the short version?" Sensing a fellow traveler, I launched into my working hypothesis. I discussed how mirror neurons might have provided a neural substrate for simulating others. As social interactions grew more complex, the capacity for such simulation would have expanded, eventually fostering a sense of an inner world. Over millennia, that inner world took on an illusory priority, leading us to believe that subjectivity is the root, when in fact it might be the fruit of a more externally driven process. Van der Linde nodded thoughtfully. This is reminiscent of certain philosophical traditions that argue we come to know ourselves only by analogy with how we know others. Some even say our sense of self is a reflection of how we are perceived. But you're adding the neural dimension, which is fascinating. He leaned forward, steepling his fingers. I suppose you've considered the concept of mentalizing, or theory of mind, how we attribute mental states to others. It's widely believed that children develop this capacity around age 4 or 5. Before that, they fail tasks like the Sally-Ann test, which measure the ability to understand that another person can hold a false belief. Perhaps the seeds of your theory can be seen there. We develop self-awareness in parallel with our growing acuity for other awareness. I smiled. Indeed, that's part of my argument. We attribute to ourselves the same mental categories we attribute to others. If that's correct, the emergent sense of I isn't a fundamental property, but rather a kind of appropriation of a system originally geared for social understanding. Van der Linde spent the next hour grilling me on details, from evolutionary anthropology to cross-cultural psychology, politely but firmly challenging each step. By the end of it, he nodded with a satisfied smile. This might be a powerful perspective. I'd love to collaborate, or at least see where your investigations lead. The lab as a playground of minds. After van der Linde's visit, I redoubled my efforts with the lab's resources. With Dr. Chen's help, I re-examined data on mirror neuron activation in certain tasks. We'd place participants in fMRI machines, showing them videos of social interactions, sometimes straightforward, sometimes featuring subtle deception. In parallel, we measured their skin conductance and other physiological markers. The data showed something interesting. The stronger a subject's ability to empathize or read subtle emotional cues, the more robust the activation in key neural networks we associate with mentalizing, including the temporoparietal junction, medial prefrontal cortex, and parts of the premotor cortex believed to contain mirror neurons. Moreover, participants who scored high on self-reflective measures, i.e., they frequently reported introspecting on their own feelings and motives, also demonstrated this pattern of brain activity. It was as though the capacity for introspection and the capacity for mind reading were intimately linked. I began weaving these findings into my evolving narrative. If introspection is heavily reliant on the same neural networks that allow for other-directed empathy and mental modeling, then perhaps our sense of self is literally the outcome of reapplying these outward-facing circuits inward. The significance? Consciousness itself, our very feeling of subjectivity, arose from a mechanism designed to handle external demands. We needed to figure out what others were going to do next to survive. Over generations, that mechanism got turned upon itself, giving us the powerful, immersive sense that we have an inner domain all our own. Evolutionary Tales. In my next conversation with Dr. Chen, I sketched out how I imagined this might have happened evolutionarily. Basic social cognition. Early hominids with rudimentary empathic or imitational abilities had a survival advantage. If you can guess that your neighbor is about to hoard resources, you might plan accordingly, either by forging alliances or by confronting them. Enhanced simulation. As social structures grew more complex, the demand for nuanced understanding of others increased. This is where mirror neuron systems and mentalizing capacities blossomed. Individuals who could better simulate other minds were more successful in cooperation and conflict. Introspective turn. Over time, the very machinery that predicted others' actions began to generate internal feedback loops. One advantage might be more precise self-control. If you can simulate your own future actions or emotions, you can plan and adapt better. This feedback loop grows more sophisticated, culminating in an increasingly rich subjective life. Mistaking the model for the real. Eventually, our ancestors started to treat these internal simulations as a direct reality. I feel, I think, I am. The subjectivity that was originally just a function or byproduct acquired a sense of primacy, overshadowing its humble origins. It became, in our minds, the core from which everything else emanates. Dr. Chen listened attentively, scribbling her own notes. "It's plausible," she said, "and it resonates with certain lines of thought in comparative psychology and anthropology. Though the real question remains, does that fully explain the what it is like aspect of consciousness?" I took a breath. Number. But maybe it dissolves the problem in a certain sense. If the entire notion of an irreducible subjectivity is an evolutionary construct, then the reason it's so intractable might be that we're dealing with a system not designed for perfect introspective transparency, but for survival-relevant simulation. The hard problem could be a mismatch between the illusions our minds generate and the reality of how they emerged. She nodded, partially convinced. That's a bold stance, but it aligns with how illusions often arise in other contexts. We evolve to see patterns, even if they're not there, because it's safer to over-detect. Maybe consciousness is the ultimate hyperactive agency detection, but turned inward. Debates in the hall. Word of my ideas spread among faculty, and soon a small group assembled for weekly browbeating sessions in the hallway, which we half-jokingly called the consciousness cage matches. Philosophers, psychologists, neuroscientists, and the occasional anthropologist would weigh in, each brandishing their discipline's perspective. Some found the theory exciting, others regarded it as half-baked or reductive. I recall a heated exchange with Professor Al-Jafari, a philosopher of mind who specialized in phenomenology. Al-Jafari, "You're turning consciousness into a functional adaptation, but that doesn't capture the raw ineffability of experience. No matter how you pass the evolutionary steps, the fact remains that there is something it is like to be a conscious organism. How do you address that?" Me. I admit the phenomenon is undeniable. But the argument is that we only notice this something it is like because of a recursive neural architecture built to model others, an architecture that turned inward. The subjective feel is an emergent property, not the bedrock. Al-Jafari. But emergent properties still require explanation. You can't wave a wand and call it a byproduct. Why would it feel like something? Why not remain a purely functional system? Me. Precisely because a purely functional system that needs to model others' subjective states might need to generate a stand-in for subjectivity within itself. That stand-in, rerun over countless generations, becomes what we call consciousness. The system can't remain purely mechanical. It has to adopt a vantage point, so to speak, to guess what it's like for the other. He stared at me, half in wonder, half in exasperation. Perhaps, but it's still lacking in direct phenomenological insight. You might be onto something, though. Keep refining it. I relished these debates because they sharpened my thesis. Each challenge forced me to articulate the kernel more precisely, that the what it is like is not a magical addition, but the natural outcome of a brain that needs to guess what it feels like to be another and eventually extends that guess to itself. It's a kind of bootstrapped subjectivity, a trick of evolution with enormous utility, but not necessarily the cosmic center we often imagine it to be. The dream deepens. All the while, the dream kept advancing. My father was a constant, but new figures started to appear. My graduate students, friends from childhood, even van der Linde in one bizarre instance. They never spoke audibly. Words would appear above their heads as written text, then evaporate. I remained silent, forced to only watch. Sometimes, in front of them, I'd see myself in the background, almost like a cameo of my waking persona, only that cameo's self would be engaged in conversation I couldn't hear. If I tried to approach, the scene would shift. One night, we found ourselves in a lecture hall reminiscent of the ones at UT Austin. My father stood at the podium, pointing to a slideshow of embryological development. He traced out how neural folds close to form the neural tube, which eventually differentiates into the brain and spinal cord. Suddenly, the slides zoomed forward in evolutionary time, showing primates, early hominids, and finally Homo sapiens. A banner flashed across the screen. Cognition for communication, self for other. My father turned, gazing directly at me, his eyes ablaze with an intensity that seemed to say, "Do you understand yet?" I woke up drenched in sweat, my mind racing. That phrase, cognition for communication, self for other, became a refrain in my waking thoughts. It perfectly encapsulated the reversal, that everything we consider so personal and inward might have begun as a mechanism for outward interaction. The self for the other. If I was correct, the entire orientation of consciousness was reversed from the standard assumption that we first have an inner self from which we interpret the outer world. The cross-disciplinary colloquium. Driven by this urgency, I organized a colloquium on consciousness, inviting Dr. van der Linde, Dr. Chen, Professor Al-Jafari, and a handful of other interested scholars. We would each present our perspectives. My talk was titled, with playful grandiosity, The Copernican and Darwinian Displacement of Subjectivity. I argued that just as Copernicus decentered Earth and Darwin dethroned humanity, this new displacement repositions consciousness as a reactive, not original phenomenon. I summarized the evolutionary arguments, the mirror neuron evidence, and the social neuroscience findings. I ended on a bold note. If consciousness originated in the need to model others, then the self is an after-effect, a grand illusion that emerges from the repeated act of simulating subjective viewpoints. We have, quite literally, turned the world inside out. And now we mistake that inside as the fundamental locus of reality, when it was, in fact, a hack, a cunning adaptation to better navigate the external environment. This might transform not only how we see each other, but how we view ourselves. The room was silent for a beat. Then questions erupted. Some found the notion liberating, others branded it reductive or incomplete. Van der Linde raised a hand, reminding the audience that illusions can still hold real power. It doesn't mean consciousness is negligible. Al-Jafari insisted we still need an account of how the neural architecture translates into lived experience. Dr. Chen added that further empirical studies could be designed to test the extent of overlap between self-modeling and other modeling. Still, despite the barrage of skepticism, I felt a simmering excitement. This conversation was no longer just about data points. It was about rethinking the place of the subjective in the grand scheme. And I realized, quite suddenly, that I was no longer ignoring my nightly labyrinth. In some paradoxical way, that dream had become the living metaphor for what I was trying to convey, an entire realm of experience locked away from expression, forcing me to recognize that none of us truly touches the inside of another's mind. We can only approximate. Rumination 3. The evidence mounts and the self unravels. I was never one to dwell in speculation without attempting to ground it in evidence. So, in the months following the colloquium, I launched a suite of experiments, drawing on volunteers from undergraduate psychology classes and a handful of graduate researchers eager to explore the frontier. We designed tasks that tested self-reflection and other reflection in tandem, measuring brain activity through fMRI, EEG, and even near-infrared spectroscopy, FNIRS, for more ecologically valid tasks. Experiment 1. Parallel introspection. Design. Participants read short vignettes about emotional scenarios, some describing their own hypothetical situation, others describing a friend's. After each vignette, we asked them to rate how they, or the friend, felt about the situation, happy, sad, neutral, etc., and how certain they were of that feeling. Aim. If the same neural circuits underlie self-awareness and other awareness, we would see overlapping activation patterns in brain regions known to be involved in mentalizing, like the medial prefrontal cortex. Findings. Preliminary results showed strong overlap in the dorsomedial prefrontal cortex when participants tried to introspect on their own emotions versus introspecting on the hypothetical friend's emotions. Sure, there were differences, but the concurrency was notable. The self versus other distinction wasn't as sharply demarcated in neural terms as one might expect. This result supported the notion that self-awareness might piggyback on the same circuits used for other awareness. But correlation alone wasn't enough. Experiment 2. Mirror feedback. Design. We used real-time video feedback so that participants saw themselves performing certain tasks but with a slight delay or in a manipulated manner that might cause confusion about agency. If participants believed they were seeing another person, how did that impact their interpretation of the mental states behind the actions? Aim. We wanted to see if participants would spontaneously apply a theory of mind approach to their own delayed or altered image, effectively attributing mental states to a figure they perceived as someone else. Findings. A surprising number of participants made statements like, "I wonder why she picked up that object," or "she seems hesitant," even though they consciously knew the video feed was themselves with a slight delay. The discrepancy between subjective knowledge and the reflexive mentalizing response was striking. EEG recordings suggested that mirror neuron-related oscillations were triggered, as if the participants were indeed observing another individual. It was a potent illustration of how the lines between self and other are more fluid than we assume. A growing credibility. As we published early reports and white papers, the academic community responded with cautious interest. A few critics said we were overinterpreting the data. Some even dismissed it as mere novelty. Of course, the same networks for self and other show overlap. That doesn't mean consciousness is derived from the latter, they proclaimed. Still, the dreamlike logic wouldn't let me rest. I was seeing evidence everywhere, from how children develop self-awareness to how we empathize, to how certain pathologies, like autism spectrum disorders, involve altered capacities for modeling other minds. It was all adding up to a single radical conclusion. The sense of me is not the source, but the result. We are so enthralled by the final product of consciousness that we overlook how it's built upon layers and layers of modeling processes shaped by social interactive needs. Late nights and textbooks. I found myself pulling out old textbooks on neuroscience and evolutionary biology, scrawling in margins about the self-model theory. Consciousness arises from the outside in, not the inside out. That was the core. The more I read, the more I realized how the standard perspective on consciousness, I am, therefore I see, might be historically rooted in Western philosophy, from Descartes onward. But in Eastern traditions, there were parallel ideas that the self is an illusion or a construct. Could it be that modern neuroscience was finally catching up to insights that had been percolating in other cultural contexts for centuries? One evening, I found a passage in a book by the cognitive scientist Merlin Donald, who argued that human consciousness is deeply shaped by cultural and communal processes. He suggested that we are networked minds, reliant on shared symbols and external scaffolding. This felt like an echo of what I was unearthing, but from a different angle. I also revisited V.S. Ramachandran's work on mirror neurons and empathy, seeing hints of how these mechanisms might undergird the bridging of subjectivity. Some paragraphs jumped off the page at me, describing how monkeys with mirror neuron lesions struggled to replicate or interpret certain actions. It was as if they lost the blueprint for guessing the intention behind observed behavior. My mind whirred. If you lose that blueprint, do you also lose some aspect of self-awareness? Unraveling my own self. The irony wasn't lost on me that as I studied how consciousness might be derived from external modeling, I felt less and less certain of my own stable I. My everyday experiences started to feel ephemeral, as though they were elaborate puppetry orchestrated by neural circuits I could only partially comprehend. And the nightly dream marched onward. In that dream, my father started to recede, and I found myself increasingly interacting with a silent version of myself. I'd see my dream self across a table or emerging from a doorway, also silent, and I was left with the bizarre suspicion that he was the real subject, and I was the ephemeral figure. Every time I tried to approach him, he would slip away. The dream lab, the dream corridors, the chalkboards covered in scribbles about subject and object, all of it was overshadowed by this chase. I realized I was hunting for a stable vantage point in the dream, some vantage point from which to anchor my sense of identity. But it never materialized. During waking hours, this dream eroded any illusions I had about being a discrete, static self. In conversations, I'd catch myself thinking, is this me talking, or an outward performance shaped by my need to express a certain role? Was the real me only the silent vantage point in the dream? The hard problem revisited. One afternoon, I was invited to speak at a philosophy of mind seminar at UT. This time, my talk was titled Reversing the Ontology, Consciousness as Reaction, Not Action. I tried to lay out, systematically, traditional ontology. Consciousness is primary, the seat of all perception, from which we interpret external reality. Reversed ontology. Consciousness arises in response to external reality, especially social reality, and is a secondary effect of modeling others. I admitted that the biggest challenge remained the hard problem. Why does any of this computational modeling generate a subjective glow? My best guess was that because we are modeling subjectivity in others, what it's like for them to experience pain, pleasure, or intention, we unwittingly generate a mental simulation that includes the feel of being an experiencing agent. Over countless iterations, that simulation morphs into what we call our own subjective experience. We are, in essence, self-tricking ourselves into believing we are the origin, when in fact, we are the product. In the Q&A, a student asked, but do we lose anything by adopting this stance? Like, do we end up denying the reality of subjective experience altogether? I paused, remembering my father's gaze in the dream. No, I replied. We don't lose subjective experience. We simply reinterpret it. We see it not as the root of all reality, but as a constructed vantage point that is very real to us, because it's an amazingly effective adaptation. Just because consciousness might be a hack of evolution doesn't negate its significance or beauty. We don't dismiss color vision as meaningless just because we know it's a property of photoreceptors and neural processing. We can still marvel at the rainbow even after we know how it's formed. The student nodded, thoughtful. I felt a quiet tension in my chest as I concluded that talk. Part of me worried that dismantling the primacy of consciousness might have dire philosophical or existential consequences. Another part of me felt an almost spiritual sense of awe that the universe had conjured up a species capable of forging such illusions to survive and thrive. Rumination 4. The debates, the allies, and the revelations. By this point in my narrative, the shape of the theory was clear, and the drama around it had begun in earnest. I found myself entangled in more public debates than I'd ever anticipated, fielding invitations to workshops and podcasts that wanted to put a neuroscientist with a radical new view on display. Meanwhile, the dream continued its inexorable progression, each night adding surreal layers to my internal sense-making. A clash at the Austin Mind Conference. The annual Austin Mind Conference was the perfect battleground for my argument. Scholars from around the world gathered to discuss everything from panpsychism to the latest in computational neuroscience. I was slotted to speak on day 2, following a keynote by a well-respected philosopher who championed integrated information theory, (TIT), as a solution to the hard problem. When I stepped on stage, I felt a surge of adrenaline. I reminded myself that I was about to propose something that many would find backward. My slides were minimal. A few bullet points, a few images of mirror neuron activation maps, some evolutionary timelines. Then I let the words flow, my voice steady. Ladies and gentlemen, I propose a Copernican shift in how we understand consciousness. Traditionally, we start from the subject, the self, and we look out into the world. But what if our fundamental capacity for subjectivity is itself derivative of our drive to model and predict others? Our ancestors needed to read the intentions and hidden states of those around them. Over millennia, the neural circuits that allowed for such inference turned inward, creating the persistent illusion of a self who is at the center of experience. We thus confuse the model with the origin. This could be the missing piece that reconciles neural function with the sense of what it is like, for we are simulating the what it is like of others, consistently, unconsciously, and thereby generating our own sense of interiority. A hush fell. I knew I had to address the obvious criticisms. Yes, the nature of subjective experience, qualia, remains mysterious, but I suggest that the reason for its mystery is precisely because it is not fundamental. It is an emergent phenomenon that was never meant to be perfectly transparent. Evolution never needed us to understand consciousness. It only needed us to have it in order to predict and navigate social realities more effectively. Questions poured in afterward. Some were outraged at the notion that they might not be the prime locus of their own being. Others found the evolutionary narrative compelling. More than a few pointed out that, if this were true, it might have implications for how we approach empathy, moral responsibility, and even artificial intelligence. Debating an AI researcher. In the hallway afterward, an AI researcher cornered me. She was excited. I'm working on predictive models that learn from social data. Your perspective suggests that once these models become sufficiently advanced at simulating human mental states, they might spontaneously develop something akin to consciousness. Do you believe that could happen? I hesitated. It depends. If the system is truly simulating subjective states, then perhaps yes. But that begs the question. Do AI systems really simulate subjective states, or do they just manipulate symbols? The root of my theory involves the capacity to embody or instantiate the perspective of another, not merely to predict outputs. She shrugged. But that line might be thinner than we think. If advanced AI can model human behavior down to the fine-grained details, who's to say it won't stumble into a self-simulation? It was a dizzying thought. Could our computational offspring replicate the very illusions we hold so dear? Could they, too, come to believe in an interior dimension that originated as a second-order modeling system? I had no definitive answer, but it underscored how radical the theory's implications could be. Allies in unlikely places. I found odd allies. A Zen Buddhism scholar approached me, explaining that certain Zen teachings describe a dissolution of the self, revealing that it was never more than a mental construct. What you're saying is quite parallel, he told me, except you're grounding it in neuroscience and evolution. But the heart of it, that the self is not primary, resonates strongly with Zen insights. We discover that the self is just a cluster of processes, not an ultimate I. I also received an email from a Christian theologian who found the idea intriguing from a different angle. If consciousness is not the origin but a reflection, maybe it points toward a deeper spiritual reality. We might not be the center, but perhaps God is the center. I'd love to dialogue about how your theory intersects with religious conceptions of the soul. Despite being a steadfast naturalist, I was fascinated by the cross-pollination of ideas. It seemed that once you dethrone the self from its pedestal, many worldviews, religious, philosophical, or otherwise, had novel ways to incorporate or challenge the perspective. Further dream encounters. The dream, in parallel, became a nightly test lab for my convictions. I started practicing a form of lucid dreaming. At certain points, I realized I was dreaming and attempted to speak. My dream father was no longer so central. Instead, the silent figure of myself took the lead. In one particularly vivid dream, I stood in a white, empty space with Dream Me. I tried to form words, but only silence emerged. The other me looked at me with pity or compassion. I couldn't tell which. Then, startling me, he spoke. "Why do you keep chasing me?" I froze, enthralled and terrified. I tried to speak back, but my mouth wouldn't move. He repeated in a slow, echoing tone, "I am the reflection. You are the reflection. We are both illusions." Then the scene collapsed, and I woke up in a panic, gasping for air. The words echoed in my head. We are both illusions. In my half-awake delirium, I scrawled it in my notebook. Maybe the sense of an inner I was chasing a phantom, and the phantom was no more or less real than the chaser. It was a Mobius strip of illusions. The seeds of doubt. It's one thing to champion a theory in the academic sphere, it's another to feel its psychological ramifications. As more evidence and arguments piled up in support of my stance, a creeping sense of dislocation set in. If consciousness is truly a hack, a second-order adaptation, then what becomes of personal meaning, moral responsibility, or the authenticity of love and pain? I found myself wrestling with these existential doubts, haunted by the possibility that the most intimate aspects of existence were ephemeral. At times, I envied those who remained blissfully content in the classical view. I am me, and that's all there is to it. I realized that unveiling illusions can be exhilarating intellectually, but it can also leave one feeling untethered. I tried to remind myself, illusions or not, the experiences still matter. Dr. Chen noticed my internal struggle. One evening, after a team dinner, she patted my shoulder gently and said, "Even if consciousness is a trick of evolution, that doesn't cheapen it, Malcolm. We live through stories, illusions, narratives. We are meaning-making creatures. The illusions are real in their effects, like a fiction that stirs genuine emotion. Sometimes the illusion is all that matters." I gave a faint smile. "Thanks, Stephanie. I just worry we might be unraveling our sense of self too far." She tilted her head. "Then maybe the next step is rebuilding meaning on top of this new foundation, not discarding it." The philosophical surprise looming. I sensed a twist in the offing. I wasn't sure how it would present itself, but my intuitions told me that once you topple the centrality of the self, something else inevitably rushes in to fill that vacuum. Perhaps it's the recognition of our deep interconnectedness, or a realization that the boundary between self and world is blurrier than we think. The final piece of the puzzle, I felt, would come not in a lab or a debate, but in a personal reckoning with the dream. Night by night, I approached that silent doppelganger, bracing for another moment of lucidity where I might glean the final clue. And sure enough, the dream was coming to a crescendo. Rumination 5. The final reckoning and the philosophical surprise. In the culminating phase of my journey, I found myself increasingly introspective. My outer life as a university neuroscientist continued, teaching classes, mentoring students, publishing papers. Yet inwardly, I was traversing new landscapes of understanding, shaped by my dreams and my evolving theory. This last rumination weaves those threads together into the resolution, or at least the next vantage point, of my story. The conference at Cambridge. Just before the final series of dream revelations, I travelled to Cambridge to present at a symposium on consciousness. By then, my work had garnered enough attention to warrant an international stage. The hallowed halls, the centuries-old architecture, felt like a suitable backdrop for a discourse on the nature of mind. My paper was titled Consciousness as the Reflection of Social Cognition, an Evolutionary Inversion. It was surprisingly well received. Scholars from different fields approached me with curiosity rather than outright dismissal. One philosopher, an elderly gentleman with a gentle British accent, quietly remarked, "You know, this kind of displacement resonates with the shift from geocentrism to heliocentrism. Many initially felt it downgraded humanity, but eventually we found it more enriching to see ourselves as part of a larger cosmic order. Perhaps we'll find the same is true of consciousness, that it's more profound to see it as a communal, emergent phenomenon rather than a solitary spark in the darkness." His comment bolstered my spirits. Yes, dethroning the self might not be so dire. It could open doors to a richer understanding of our place in nature. The dream's climax. Upon returning to Austin, I sensed that the dream was approaching its apex. Each night, the silent labyrinth grew more surreal. Corridors branched into impossible fractal shapes, occasionally opening into vast spaces of cosmic color. The father figure was now a distant memory, overshadowed by the presence of my double. We would wander through empty lecture halls, deserted labs, and endless archways, neither of us speaking, until one night I again achieved lucidity. I stood in a large chamber that resembled a cathedral fashioned out of neural tissue. Stained glass windows displayed the silhouette of neurons, synapses, and branching dendrites, illuminated by a pale light. My dream double approached, looking into my eyes with a strange mixture of empathy and detachment. I forced myself to speak. "Who are you?" I asked, my voice trembling with wonder that I could speak at last. I responded quietly. "I am the model you built to understand others, and you are the model built to hold me." The words reverberated in the cathedral. I felt tears streaming down my dream face. "Are we both illusions, then?" I managed to ask. He nodded solemnly. "Yes, illusions shaped by necessity, but illusions can be the most real things in the world if they guide thought and action." I swallowed, feeling an immense weight lift off my chest. The dream started to fade around the edges, but before it dissolved completely, my double whispered, "Stop clinging to the idea that you began it all. Look outward, then inward, then out again. The circle completes itself." And then I woke, heart pounding, tears staining the pillow. The dream was over, or at least that arc of it. I felt a profound peace, as though I'd touched the heart of the labyrinth. The perspective was clear. The I that I so fervently protected was indeed a model, a reflection of reflections, a vantage point conjured by the same engine that attempts to see into the hearts of others. The philosophical surprise. In the days that followed, as I integrated that final dream message, I stumbled upon a philosophical insight that surprised even me. I had spent months or years proclaiming that consciousness was derived from outward modeling, that the within was secondary. But the dream's last words gave me a hint. Look outward, then inward, then out again. The circle completes itself. What if the final truth is not just that consciousness arises from modeling others, but that in so doing, the line between inside and outside collapses altogether? We are used to thinking in a dualistic mode. There's me, the subjective center, and there's the world of objects and other beings out there. My theory proposed that the sense of me is shaped by my attempts to simulate them. But in that swirling dance, the boundaries blur until the notion of a distinct self or a distinct other becomes as fluid as the tides. The surprise, then, is that once you realize consciousness is a communal, interactive phenomenon, there is no real I or you or world that stands alone. We become living processes in an ever-shifting tapestry of interactions. In a sense, we are each other's illusions, forging identity in the space between impressions and expressions. I wrote in my journal, "Surprise realization." By dethroning the self from its absolute centrality, we might see that consciousness is a continuous creation of shared modeling. The I emerges in the same space where the you emerges, and both are interdependent illusions. In a way, no one is at the center, because the center is everywhere and nowhere. The aftermath. In the subsequent months, I began discussing this final insight with close colleagues and friends. Some found it profoundly liberating, others saw it as too mystical. But for me, it filled the existential gap I had worried about. We are not alone in our illusions. Every conscious being is forging the same illusions through reciprocal modeling. There is an interconnected web of subjectivities, each arising from the interplay of outward and inward gazes. We have simply mislabeled it as a set of isolated minds. I delivered a public lecture at UT Austin on this very topic, culminating in a statement that drew from both neuroscience and the dream. If consciousness arose as a strategy to understand others, then your consciousness and mine are intertwined at the root. We are living in each other's predictive models, just as we inhabit our own. Realizing this might bring us closer to a sense of shared being, dissolving the illusory walls we've erected. Perhaps empathy, at its deepest level, is not just understanding another mind, it's remembering that we were never truly separate to begin with. The audience response was a mix of awe and skepticism, but I sensed a stirring in the room. Maybe the seeds of a new paradigm were taking root. Epilogue. A walk by the UT Tower. Months later, with the dream having receded to a calmer presence in my nights, I found myself strolling across the UT campus at dusk. The tower loomed above, bathed in burnt orange. I paused near a live oak tree, its branches arching overhead like neural pathways. I reflected on my journey, from the initial, startling dream about my father, through the labyrinth of discovery, the debates, the data, the fierce arguments, and finally, the dream confrontation with myself. I realized that, in many ways, my life's work was no longer about discovering the final answer to consciousness. Instead, it was about posing a new question. How might we live differently if we understand that consciousness is not an isolated property, but a relational phenomenon? Could we cultivate deeper compassion, knowing that the seat of our I is entangled with the others we model? Could we drop some of the ego-driven illusions that cause so much suffering? I found comfort in that line of thought, even if the journey was incomplete. After all, science and philosophy are never truly done. We peel back one layer only to find another. But for now, I felt that I had at least cracked a window into a new vantage point, one that sees consciousness not as the origin, but as a glorious, complex consequence of our attempts to engage with the world around us. And that shift in perspective was enough to give me a strange, buoyant joy as I continued my walk beneath the canopy of the oak. I might not have all the answers, but I carried with me the paradoxical solace that emerges when we realize we are illusions that can still learn, grow, love, and be loved. illusions that matter to each other and to ourselves. And in that swirl of subjectivities, each reflection illuminates another, weaving the tapestry of consciousness that in the end belongs to no one and everyone at the same time.